Morning, Dr. Brad. It's
Oh,
oh, look at me wave my dirty coffee cup. Yuck, yuck. I gotta um I just cleaned it yesterday and I made a mess in 24 hours.
not for the squeamish.
No, well, it's a tool, right? I mean, it's like having, your saw or your other tools in your workshop, and of course they get dirty with work, and same thing happens with nerds and coffee cups, I guess. But anyway, you were making an observation that you were having some thoughts this morning, and I thought that was going to lead to something useful.
Oh yeah, so I had to wake up early because I was stirred from my slumber with ideas of ternary logic in historical function. So I wrote a couple tweets about this. If they're still called tweets, they're posts certainly.
Tweets will stick. I don't know what else.
Right, and it's like the issue is this: is that there's a supply, there's a demand, and there's an equilibrium that gets disturbed in what we call historic events.
Yes.
And that's all. And it's just like that. So I just made note of it in several significant historic events and made some observations available for the people who are interested in
I
such.
did not have the luxury of seeing those bits of wisdom from you yet this morning.
It just allows you to see allows an individual to see the ternary logics in human scales functioning.
Ah, yes, this is good. Oh, I see what you're doing. Very smart, Dr. Brad.
Just trying to throw some breadcrumbs out for the fellows.
Yeah, but this is like sophisticated. Oh, how lovely.
That's why I couldn't wait. I couldn't go to sleep. I had to get up early, and then I'm like, okay. Then I worked for about an hour, and then I was like, okay. I went to my early hours early, about an hour, and then that's when I took a nap at 7 when I got done.
This is actually extremely good work. So why is it that if I acknowledge you've done something wonderful, I feel like I have to turn it into I have to spin it into teasing?
It's just the way you're put together. It's your nature. It's just oversupply of it.
Well, now I can't say it. I've ruined it. So, but that's pretty sophisticated stuff you're writing right there, right? I mean,
Yeah, it's just what it is. It's like elementary in its function, though, right?
yes.
And it's just an application of such an elementary function to something that hasn't been really
Reduced to its elementary
articulated,
form.
right?
Yes.
But it's really atomic, isn't it? It's just real. Here's the
Yeah. So tedious. And you can't explain to people that equal sign is a test of equilibrium, right? And that you see this really interesting progression from arithmetic to mathematics to algebra to calculus. We didn't get that right. Arithmetic to mathematics to geometry to algebra to the calculus before it gets applied to human endeavors, which is that everything we do is bound by the same laws in other words, the reason our epistemology of the equal sign works is because that's how the universe works. Right? I mean, it's so stupidly obvious, it's painful.
well, the interesting part is it just takes time to figure out it. That's what it is. Because it's like this. It's like being the product individually, being the product of such an operation in action, and becoming aware of it, and then being able to apply that generalization to all the operations.
Uh-huh.
That's not a small task.
Well, it isn't, but again, it's another example of we thought in terms of words, for the meaning of words for a long time. That was very hard to escape. Because the meaning of words is still an anthropomorphic view of the universe. It's like, what does it mean to us? Versus what is the universe doing and why do we have this thing called meaning? Right. And all the way across the spectrum. So it's another example of our back and forth curve here where we incrementally increased our knowledge and we're recursively eliminating error from our previous groups, thus making it possible for non-false ideology, philosophy, and religion and mythology, right? I mean, we're making it possible for non-false.
Which is interesting because it's like doing that work is like the American Civil War was difficult for me to do, which I did in a separate post.
I saw that.
And it's like that was what was interesting because that one caused the falsification of the equilibrium that the South sought.
Yes.
Falsification by the North's aggressive behavior and demand for militant response, and the South was insufficient to provide the response that caused them to survive, so they failed. And that was interesting because that analysis that one required a little bit of thinking because it wasn't straightforward.
Correct. Can we run with that? Because that's an important insight relevant to today.
Sure.
See if you can do the same for today. So the part of the conflict in the South was, of course, the South paid all the taxes, right? It was frankly the spirit of culture, but the North, but it was dependent upon slave labor, which was a more middle class society, where the South was a more aristocratic society. And so you have a middle class Christian and an aristocratic Christian societies, and these are sort of in competition, right? And they're in competition because they have very different modes of production. It's rapidly industrializing North, and a majority agrarian, mass agrarian South. I mean, a huge agrarian productivity out there, and they're paying all the taxes. So of course they feel justified their missions. Now, there's a conflict here, right? There's a conflict, but that conflict only appears to matter once we're talking about seizing the rest of the continent. Right. So I sense you jumping ahead of me here. So let me finish my arc. Sorry.
Very wise.
What?
Very wise.
So, it actually is more important for both North and South to keep Europe out of the West. Right. It actually is for both of them more important to keep the empires out of the continent and to lock down the continent for their own use, just out of self-defense. Yes, it was for profit. Yes, it was for gain. Those are benefits. But the other reason is the freaking Europeans are just at war all the time. And we want to just be middle class and make money. So there's this whole strategic advantage. But we're having a similar problem today. We have a traditional class that's masculine, that is middle class and aristocratic. And that's broken into certainly the North and the South. Excuse me, that's broken now not to the North and South. It's broken into the center and the coasts.
Yeah.
So you have a conflict between the center and the coasts. Of course, the strategic value is hasn't ended. It's really important to keep island America with its two oceans, an island, so that it's free of the crises that have impacted the world island of Eurasia for all of human history, right? So this actually is a profoundly important necessity to maintain loyalty, right? Loyalty on the continent over
Yeah.
loyalty to an externality. That's what's important. I know, notice somebody thinking about what about loyalty to Israel? Okay, that's part of it, but I mean, it's the same. That's the problem at a micro scale, right? So what the issue here is that we're in the similar position as we were in the Civil War, in that there's an asymmetry of taxes between the coasts and the productivity of the center. In other words, the food, the water, the transport, all the basics, the center. Very similar agrarian versus urban problem. And it's also a very serious cultural problem. So we would call that the feminine liberal and the masculine conservative heartland. So we're in the same problem today. So how would you trifunctional, excuse me, how trifunctional is political, ternary is the general, right? So the general rule, whereas trifunctional is the political application of the ternary.
Right.
So how would you state this ternary logic of the present, like we stated the ternary logic of the Civil War? In other words, it's the same problem. It's just a shift. Whereas now the South and the heartland have, in other words, the agrarians still have a higher interest than the trading places, which is the West and East.
Higher interest. It's like the issue is that the red center is the masculine. It doesn't matter what they're one polarity, and the coastal, blue coastal, which I don't like these colors because it's reversed. It really should be red. Red. The Dems are red.
Yes.
The aristocratic elite are red, but that's just my aside. The center public, the word eludes me. That's funny, right? The populists,
Yep.
represent
Middle class manners, ethics, morals.
like I call them the masculine in this case because they're providing supply and they are tired of providing supply for aristocratic leaders that aren't interested in their input.
They're not aristocratic. They're
but they're
credentialists, but yeah, credential.
They regard themselves as elite.
Elites is the right word, not aristocracy.
So the issue is that the populists are not interested in supplying the coasts anymore. And the coasts are demanding it in any case without regard to volunteerism by the populist center. And so this demands a renegotiation and a new equilibrium must take place.
Right.
And it remains to be seen how this will work out because it's like they're attempting to stuff the place full of illegals.
Well, what they want is dependence, because dependence increase their authority. And since the system is dependent upon numbers, right, at least some of it, because we still have some semblance of concurrency, right? But I mean, if you look at a demographic map of the United States, it's basically New York, New Jersey, and California, Southern California. It's mostly Southern California.
Chicago.
And then Chicago. I mean, that's just all there is. And it's a debate between mostly the two coasts with some contribution from Chicago. to produce this. And this is to say that there isn't a liberal contingent in Denver, but I mean,
And Minneapolis.
Minneapolis and other shithole cities.
Oh, you forgot St. Louis. It is that about covers it.
Right, but there's a difference between a shithole city and a city that is so large that it, despite being 80% shithole, is 20% not. Which is what you see in all the European cities, right? I mean, if you go, I mean, my favorite example is Vienna, which is a living art form in the downtown area, but is a shithole around it for 20-mile ring around it.
Really?
Same as Paris. The Ile-de-France, the whole area around Paris. I mean, there's the Parisian core is where the millionaires live, right? And it's beautiful, and the tourists like to go there, but it's a shithole for 20 miles around it, right? It's just like New York's geographic positioning doesn't allow it to be as circular as Vienna, or
right,
Paris, or any of the other major cities, because of all the freaking waterways and such, and difficulty in travel. But I mean, there's Manhattan, and then there's Yonkers and Brooklyn, and North New Jersey, which goes on a while, etc. And thankfully, Pennsylvania is somewhat insulated from that and so is some parts of southern New York, at least to the east. So you tend to have a city, a ring that's a shithole. And with all that matters is the size of this core that's not a shithole. Like for Baltimore, where is it not a shithole? Where for Detroit, where is it not a shithole? For Oakland, where is it not a shithole? For I try not to pick on the South so much, right? But St. Louis, right? I mean the suburbs of St. Louis, which I have had family there, moved there for business, not because of choice. And you could have there were suburbs that are quite nice, just like there are suburbs of Baltimore and DC that are nice. That doesn't mean you want to be around DC very often. It's a shithole. If you don't want to be around Baltimore, it's a shithole. My friend What a Faultist I'm forbidden from talking about Philadelphia, because that's his hometown, so I'll avoid that one. But you have to have a certain amount of liberals and wealth and redistribution to produce a shithole, and the more you have, the more the shithole dominates, and the urban and the core where the millionaires live differs. So say the left produces favelas,
yes,
because it doesn't demand responsibility in exchange for support, whereas the right demands responsibility.
But it's even more interesting because it's like the way the left is, they're vampiric, and they suck the life out of the surroundings and occupy the best bits of the towns, and then they use the favela as the weight necessary to control the politics, to extract from the places that they do not physically control.
Correct.
That's what's going to drive the new equilibrium, which is going to be away from centralization of authority in the United States and towards local control.
Well, I mean, if we maintained concurrency, so that we required demonstrated competency in order for contribution to commons, in order for political participation, they wouldn't be able to do it. But some democracies are facilitating urbanization and centralization of authority and control. Because what responsibility can you have in a village or a farm town or a suburb? You can actually have some. What responsibility can you have in a city? You can't. So, versus what opportunity costs are in the city? Very low. And what opportunity costs are in the rural areas? It's
Right.
fairly high. So you have this odd symbol of the urban centers have very low opportunity cost. Under mass democracy, they have the ability to attract people, in other words, serfs, and to use the number of serfs to extract from middle class. It's the productive class, which is what you were saying.
Until the populists exert themselves and adjust the equilibrium. That's how it will go.
Well, I mean, it's going to happen, right? This is somebody just. How does Curt get away with saying? "Oh, I'm like, I don't say I want to do this. I say this is going to happen." Right? This conflict is going to happen because it's deterministic. There's no way out of it. It always happens throughout history, so it's going to happen. The question is, do you want to bring it about in an uncontrolled manner? Or do you want to bring it, in other words, do you want to have chaos and destruction, whatever? Or do you want to present a solution and bring it about in a controlled manner? My attitude is bring it about like the founders did, which is produce a common lawsuit against the state. Implicit in that is that there's going to be a threat if it isn't settled. But I mean, it's not like we're creating the threat. It's like the threat exists one way or the other. So the whole point is, how can we limit the harm? How can we avoid the harm of a civil war by restoring meritocratic order, restoring responsibility.
That's what it means. Meritocratic is responsibility.
Right. And so as people say, they tend to have merit is like what I do has value. Well, you don't know that unless there's evidence of it by exchange.
Right.
Then the second thing is the way you get meritocratic by exchange is responsibility. So you have to demonstrate responsibility in order to produce meritocracy, right? And so these are two. This is the input is responsibility, the output is meritocracy. So the problem is if you don't produce the input, which is responsibility, you won't produce the output, which is what's the other word I was using? Meritocracy. You'll produce authority and dependency.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay that if a lot of people want to have authority and dependency, but they can't have it on other people. And you say, well, I don't want to have meritocracy and responsibility for my half of the population. Fine. Then we have to split so you can have a population where you have authority and dependency, and we'll have a population that provides responsibility and meritocracy. The difference is you'll continue to descend as we'll continue to prosper. Now, will that always be true? Well, authoritarian states can move very quickly.
Right.
But they can't move sustainably. Whereas meritocratic states can move sustainably, but they tend to move more slowly. Now, move and adapt are two different words. So under authority, you could command people to do things, right? You can get something done, but then the people organize against the command over time.
Right.
Whereas in a going concern, as in meritocracy, it's people will always organize toward the optimum, but it will take them longer to agree on some short-term thing. The difference is once they agree, they won't organize against it. This is why authority produces corruption, which is, right, they're both rent, and meritocracy produces rent seeking. Right? You get two different things. You get internal corruption or external corruption. And so which of these is easier to correct? Well, under the meritocratic rule of law system, You don't need someone's approval to correct. You need to prosecute a case in court. Whereas the authoritarian system, you need to coerce someone into giving up a privilege. So
Right.
this is the reason why I always think this is funny. It's like everybody tries to have this conversation. I heard another one the other day, which I thought was ridiculous. They won't explain it like I just did, which is that in the end, it's not just one step and therefore it's one step creates another, and then therefore. So you have this hierarchical equilibrium producing. And yeah, well, so this is why you don't want don't want concentration of people in urban centers that produce demand for authority. If you're going to have people concentrated in urban centers, you have to break them up into neighborhoods that are locally governed that impose responsibility and responsibility instead of promote authority. And unfortunately, democracy makes it easier to vote for authority. Right? And so, whereas the courts make it impossible to vote for authority, that is to produce authority. I mean, fundamentally, what do the courts do? We call it impose irreciprocity. What do they really mean? We're imposing authority. We're imposing the absence of authority, right? We're imposing the prohibiting authority by imposing responsibility. Whereas the left is doing the opposite. They're generating authority by disposing of responsibility. But you will never run out of people who want to be children.
Right.
Right. You're just never going to do it because it's responsibilities work. Right. So, you're in this constant problem of the feminine mind, the feminine minded's desire for irresponsibility, right? For parentage or men to do everything. And you have the rights concern for everybody needs to be damn responsible so that we don't have to have any of that shit. Right. Now, in the end, the right is right. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, I didn't expect to come to that conclusion, by the way. I just want to set it out. That was not what I expected.
It was an accident.
But in the end, the right is right. In the end, the right's right about almost everything as of how to talk about being right, which is the irony of it is just so fucking palpable. I can't stand it. But the left is right. The left is right is that you can't take responsibility. You can't force people to have responsibility they're not competent to have.
Right.
Right. Okay. I don't think the right objects to that. They object to those people that can't bear responsibility having say in what responsibility consists of. Right.
Right. To governance. It's like the irresponsible really ought not be responsible for our polity. How about that?
Exactly. I mean, and then there's like our credential is demonstrating responsibility. No. Or if a guy runs a series of factories that produce, he's demonstrating responsibility. All right. I mean, to some degree, if a guy runs a town and it's doing well, he's demonstrating responsibility.
A guy runs a hot dog cart.
What?
He's running a hot dog cart. He's demonstrating some responsibility.
Right. I was trying to get there. I was like, okay, I gave the wrong order, so now I got to go down to the family and work down. But yeah.
Sorry.
No, it was just true. I mean, if your family is self-sufficient, you're demonstrating responsibility, right? But the minute you're not self-sufficient, you're not demonstrating responsibility. So,
right. So the issue is that the false equation of the successful rent seeker to demonstrating responsibility is false.
Yes.
And that they don't distinguish between them because that's our democracy, please.
Oh, democracy, the reason we have the democracy we do is a set of accidents that were a mistake. Jefferson is right, and that you want the largest number of people to participate possible as long as those people are responsible. Right? It's the irresponsibles we don't want to have participate. Well, the problem is that the United States was founded on no taxation without representation. So as we expanded the workforce to people who had income we wanted to tax, then it was no,
Wait, you're talking about 1913?
thought about up through gradually across the 1800s.
Oh,
Right, this problem reaches its peak in the formation of the income taxes, which is why women got in, right? Not out long after it, right? I mean, this is why. So the problem is that you're not taxation is for your juridical defense, right? It's not for your political influence. Your political influence has to be like, just like your juridical defense has to be earned by non-criminality, the negativa, just as Christianity works. Your political contribution is determined only by your contribution to the commons, which means that you've demonstrated responsibility for more than yourself. And so what you've done is you said, okay, we commingled two different criteria. Whereas in history, the reason you voted is because you fought. We tried to extend that to not only did you fight, but you contributed to the governance of the commons. Right? I mean, right? And so that's what happened, right? You fought, then you got contribution to the commons. Then what happened is we had people that were paying tax, now prosper enough to actually pay taxes, right, in some meaningful form. They wanted to legitimize that, so they wanted more people. However, that well-meaning European Christian bit of nonsense was happening at the same time. The Marxist illegitimacy was
right. Now, I was going to say this is that the obvious subterfuge that it seems obvious to consider this potential for subterfuge in the creation of the income tax in the United States in 1913 is that they wanted to support the war. They wanted to generate World War I, and they needed to make sure that the financial apparatus was in place. That's obvious. But it's less obvious to go, hey, let's make it so we can tax everybody, and then we can justify getting all these low guys into the government for our Marxist plan that will take place in the next 100 years.
right. Though I want to say again, this is a tendency of people on the right to attribute malice to everyone equally, when there are two factions here. There is the malicious left faction, and the optimistic Christian faction.
I call them the little deluded dupes.
Well, I mean, Christianity did work. Just, you got to say this, you got to understand it does work, right? We can't fault.
They're just misled, and they're overly
well, no, hold on. They're not. The problem is that you can't just let it happen by magic. In other words, they believe it's a natural portion of man that will be expressed. It's not. Even Christianity was imposed. Now, the Christians don't want to say that, but Christianity was spread by the sword, right? It was a little religion, like woke is, right? It was a little religion before it was imposed, but it was imposed by the sword almost everywhere else, just like Islam. So when we say this, we're like, well, you had to impose that morality by the sword. Well, we could have extended these things if we had imposed responsibility by the sword, and we didn't. We did it through Christian optimism, which is.
Wait, you forgot to add this. So far,
the belief that Christians have that their indoctrination and the instincts that they produce, the intuitions they produce in indoctrination, are natural, is very weird to me. I don't mean, how could you even be in the religion?
that's a funny thought right there. That's a funny thought.
They're only waiting to be awakened, like this flowering of your special snowflake child. Right? I mean, it's just ridiculous. You know, we're just animals and we adapt to whatever pragmatic purposes we can. So what are you laughing at me for now? What did I do now?
I'm just imagining the comments below. It's all good.
Anyway, so the end result is that the real problem is that the disconnect between membership, which provides defense, right? Juridical defense, which is a via negativa, right?
Yeah.
And the via positiva of legislation. And what responsibility do you have to demonstrate to be a free man here? Well, you have to be responsibility for your actions. Right? The problem with political responsibility is you have to be responsible for the actions of others. And and those two things are in constant conflict. Why are you laughing at me again?
Well, it's just the premise, and this is my objection to it, is the premise that a person who's not capable of taking responsibility for themselves, having some authority in the action of others in management, is just absolutely absurd.
Right. You know, there's just no. I just noticed. You know, I bought a lot of companies, right? So I have a non-ideological view. I have a very Austrian view of human behavior. In other words, because political behavior and religious behavior are increasingly abstract.
Right.
They're all the more you get the economic behavior is demonstrated. Right. Political behavior is an abstraction. Right. I don't have to demonstrate much to get there. And religious behavior is just it's all words. And so I sit there and say, I'm letting you test that. But in other words, there's no falsification of my faith. Right.
Nobody's faith is falsifiable.
Right. There's no, and to falsify the political takes a long time. Right. I mean, but to falsify my economic utility.
That's like now.
It's now, right? I mean, it happens right now.
It's interesting in time over time.
Yes. God, you're getting fucking scary, man. You're scaring me now. You're getting so good. So the issue here is that when we look at the buying companies, you have to think about, how do I generate responsibility?
Okay.
Because that's actually the problem in most companies, right? It's, where is the responsibility being directed? Because you're trying to create an equilibrium of myself, my team, my organization, and the business, right? And mankind. You're trying to create this thing, but that usually we call this capture, right? I'm going to just work here for myself alone.
Right.
Like, I'm going to diss on Microsoft here. It's possible to work at Microsoft and only do an hour of work a day and get paid a lot of money. It's very easy, actually. If you manage the information system correctly. So you notice that some people in that company and companies like it have a lot of time, do a lot of stuff outside of work.
Okay.
Now let's take it at the people who got fired from Twitter, right? Okay. And how much of what they were doing was actually work related versus religiously related, essentially.
Right.
Or the people that you've seen the videos, I'm sure, of what life like at Google. Right. I mean, like it's very obvious that the woman who made this video doesn't do any work all day. I mean, it's basically like, you would leave the TV on, watch your favorite shows, and then you'd go over to work a puzzle piece now and then, and go do something else and make lunch and maybe take a look at a puzzle. I mean,
but it's really hard not to believe that you're doing God's work in such circumstances. Right. It's utopia, man.
Whereas, the guy who's working in an Amazon warehouse is being
Oh
taxed.
my, oh
The one,
my,
the one that I don't like is the degree of rigor they put UPS drivers through is, I don't like it, right? I mean, they get paid pretty well, right? I mean, you can make good, okay money, but it's like picking on the little guy when I know how the tier works, right?
right?
Time you get to middle management, you're getting 2 hours of work out of somebody a day, right? And then it flips in senior management as those fucking people never stop working. Right, so you have the guy at the bottom and the guy at the top, and the people, and increasingly this middle, it does less. My critic is usually the people I try to get rid of are usually middle management companies because it's really obvious they don't do anything. Right, they're functioning as a human information system that's easily replaced by a computer, which is what we generally do. My company does is we put software in place that keeps information going, so there's almost no value to them. There is no value to a middleman.
It reduces the friction in the middle.
Right, and those people usually don't do much work and they consume a lot of income. And so that was obvious in most of America in the 1980s, which is why we had the great workforce reduction in the 1980s. But it's become increasingly obvious, and part of my software's goal is to get rid of people who control information as a means of, right? But what you really want is you either got mentors in your right, mentors, right? Who are mentors because they're still practicing the craft, or you have dead weight, right? And I don't like the dead weight. The dead weight can be gotten rid of. So when you buy a lot of companies, it's just how do you say, how do I allocate? How do I give people? I think of it this way: how do I give people the tools they need to be responsible? And how do I give them enough information to understand what responsibility consists of? So it's basically put the software in place and hyper communicate. Right? It's just fucking simple. Well, what's the problem in the polity, right? We have a similar problem. We have shit information. We have a bunch of middle managers who are crooks. Right? I mean, it's just unbelievable. And then we have the outside interests that are external to the government that are crooks. Now, does this mean that all people who work in the government are? No. It means that you can tell the ones that are. Like, how many people think that the IRS and the whoever does your driver's license and car registration are good.
DMV.
Right, DMV. How many people think they do a good job? You find the occasional, I know one, right? You find the occasional person who's actually trying to be helpful. But it's because the person is basically Christian. That it's always going to turn out to be that. The person's been indoctrinated in the Christian, and they work in this environment. They ignore it all because they're going to do God's work on their terms when they're interacting with somebody. But most of them it's crap. And then a lot of them they're just evil. Right? They're punitive, right? They're helpful. Punitive, work avoiding, nasty, and evil. And you get this in a lot of stuff. Like dealing with Social Security, if you can, the Social Security is okay. Deal with the IRS, you might as well assume you're working with mob.
Oh yeah.
Because these are the kind of people that came up through the bill collecting. Well, these are not good people. Right? I mean that they're you can't be a good person to do that job for a career. Right? So the kind of people in the IRS tends to go downhill. And even with the agents, right? They just, there's a big difference between people who make mistakes or people who have magical thinking and whatever. And they're not trying, it used to be that the purpose of the IRS was to produce a going concern. In other words, it wasn't so important that you paid the taxes that you had skipped, unless you were intentionally malicious.
Oh, yeah.
It's more that we're trying to get you to be a going concern as a human, so you're not dependent on the state. Right? Which is what you'd expect, right? But they don't work like that. There's no juridical defense from the IRS. You can't sue an IRS agent for games.
They never sign anything.
So, and they never take, there's no accountability in the system at all, right? It's always your fault. Even though they don't take responsibility and accountability for giving the information to do things right. Which is fucking amazing. Well, it's the same thing when you go into the courtroom sometimes, like we're not allowed to give legal advice. I'm not asking you for legal advice. I'm asking you for what the procedure is that you follow.
Procedural advice, right?
Right, and they so try to avoid it at all times. So you say, I'm not asking you for legal advice, your procedural advice. Legal advice would be related to the code. Procedural
Right.
advice is related to your policy. You can give me policy advice. You can't give me code advice, right? Well, the reason is, well, why not? Well, I have the opposite opinion. Is why isn't everybody working in the fucking court of lawyers? They can give you legal advice. Why are these people even here if they can't give us legal advice? Why are you even talking to the public if you can't give legal advice? I mean, isn't that what a lawyer is? It's called an officer of the court for a reason.
Right.
That's what it means to be a lawyer, is you're an
Right.
officer of the court. Right. So, I mean, if you can't, so why am I talking to you if you're not an officer? You're in the court telling me about the court, yet you're not an officer of the court. You can't tell me what I should do, but you can tell me how the operations work. If you're not
Right.
willing to do that, why the fuck do you have this job?
Right.
It's not like we have an undersupply of lawyers. I mean, there's one lawyer for every 300 people in the goddamn country. We don't need that many lawyers.
Madness.
Anyway, so sitting here. So we've burned an hour already, almost, on this particular question. So I actually thought it was a really good arc you started there. And I think we've probably completed it, haven't we?
I think so.
Yes. So let's call this a short. How do we name this? What did you start out with? You started out with
About the ternary logics
applied
and the
to,
operations in human scale,
yes. So
in historic context.
let's cut this here, then roll into our working session. So do your thing.
Oh, hey, that's great. That means the nice people can hit like, subscribe, and then hit the notification bell, and then they can leave their comments below.
Love you, man. Tell Brad he's charming.
Oh my. I'm waiting for Curt to get tired of that.
No, I think it's got legs, man.